Welcome to Field Notes. Today we're talking with Jeff Hadachek, an assistant professor of ag economics with UW-Madison and also a UW-Madison Extension specialist. Today, the topic that we have here is conservation economics. And I'm going to just punt it over to Jeff to talk about why is that important.
Yeah, and I mean, you look around the state today, and you hear a lot of conversations around issues with water quality. Nationally, we have conversations about the extent of greenhouse gas emissions, and oftentimes those conversations are sort of in tension with um, really intensive production of goods. In particular, within agriculture, it's intensive production of agricultural products. And so, I think economics really gives us sort of a tool set to evaluate sort of those trade-offs and to be able to find the right balance of um, what is the optimal extent of conservation, what are the appropriate practices that we should be implementing as a society as a whole. And I think we get tools to be able to have those conversations quantitatively and to be able to bring sort of actual data points to those conversations. And so that's what I hope we can jump into today.
Definitely. So Jeff, how about we start with just like an overview of the work that you do and sort of like the intersection of conservation and economics in general.
Right. Yeah. And I think, there's a lot of misconceptions about what economists do and what we do know and what we don't know. And so I think that's a good place to start. But generally, I'm gonna guess most people probably know sort of or have heard the terms like supply and demand before, right? And those are really sort of the levers that economists use to sort of evaluate any challenge that um, is before us. And so I think, with conservation, um, we really have what's the supply of conservation versus what's the demand for conservation. On one side, the demand for conservation can really be dictated by like what are the environmental services that conservation practice may provide. Maybe it's cleaner water, maybe it's cleaner air or better soil health, right? These are some like those are the sort of the demand side things that may be policy or um, other sort of incentive mechanisms may be put in place, sort of these financial incentives to demand conservation. But on the supply side, right, it really comes down to what um, a farmer can supply, right? Like what makes sense for their budgets and what makes sense for their operations. Most of the time, that is dictated by financial things, but oftentimes it's other behavioral things too. Like it's the belief about what you're doing. It's the perception, knowledge gaps. Like all of those things can kind of sort of play a role into feeding into the objective function for the farmer. I said most of the time that means it's evaluating like whether something's profitable or not, but other times it's more of a behavioral kind of conversation as well. Is it our neighbors doing it, or do you have the knowledge to do it yourself? So all of those things sort of matter and feed into the sort of quote unquote economics of it, and so that partial budget analysis is really just part of it. But yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So you're kind of talking about the behavioral aspect too, and how like um, the demand of conservation can somewhat drive like the supply of conservation as the farmer is like able. Um, what are we discussing usually when we're talking about that behavior change on farm? And I realize that that's something that probably changes quite a bit depending on policies and like new research that comes out. But right now for conservation economics, what are the types of practices we're usually taking a look at?
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, you were right though, is that like most of that is sort of dictated by like what policies are in place and what is talked about by extension professionals. So, cover crops and no-till are sort of the two workhorses when it comes to these conversations around um, conservation in general, particularly in our traditional sort of row crop operations here in the Corn Belt. There's reason why those two are sort of the workhorses is one, it's like they've been around for a long time and we sort of know um, who know how to use those technologies and practices. But also from like a policy perspective, when you're sort of incentivizing individual practices, like there's a lot of things that farmers can do that could be under the umbrella of conservation, but to actually measure that, to actually say like, is something being done on the landscape? Oftentimes it's a measure like has to simplify that down to sort of these two measures, and oftentimes that's the adoption of no-till and the adoption of cover crops. But I mean, there are certainly other practices like riparian buffers or stream bank restoration, that all of those things also are like under the umbrella of conservation. But when we look at like what federal funding goes to or what state funding goes to in the state of Wisconsin, the majority of it, and the two leading recipients are cover crops and no-till. And so, I mean, and rightfully so, those two practices can go a long way to, keeping those nutrients in the field and not in our water, and keeping the soil in our field too, right? And preserving that soil for years to come.
And so it sounds like, these no-till and cover crops, which is, as you mentioned, this workhorse of conservation within the state and, nationwide. It seems an almost structural reason for that. It's because it's easier to grasp, it's kind of tangible, and it's within these production systems. It's not to the side like a riparian buffer is, but, and it's kind of a mindset game, right? And so, but does that bear out as well economically? Is when we run the economics of it, like you do as an economist, um, are those the more economically beneficial practices amongst conservation practices? Are there ones that we should actually be pushing that do see a much more tangible benefit to farmers? And is there always a benefit to these conservation practices or not?
Yeah. The measurement of adoption is actually sort of the better measure, I would say, um, of economics rather than actually dollars and cents. Most of the time, that adoption is driven by the dollars and cents, right? And when it comes to no-till, like that dollars and cents is like you're spending less time in the field. So not only is it like are you spending less money on fuel and machinery to actually have the tillage equipment in place or whatever, but you have less time in the field. And so um, oftentimes, and I think Michael, you've heard me say this, and Will, you've heard me say this before, but it's like when you compare cover crops and no-till, um, no-till is a different sell because you're asking farmers to do less, right? Maybe you have to apply additional herbicide to terminate weeds or whatever in place of the tillage, but you're asking less time in the field. Whereas cover crops, you're asking farmers then to manage another living thing that has its own risks, that has its own potential effects on your cash crop then in the following year, right? So and so you're asking then cover crops, you're asking farmers to do more. So the two sort of it's not just a blanket statement about whether whether both things pencil out, and oftentimes I think what we see that and then going back to this adoption comment is that adoption for no-till is a lot higher than adoption for cover crops in the state, and I think that's like I said, the measure that I'm thinking about oftentimes is what's driving that adoption. And some of those factors that I talked about, I think, are the real drivers behind that. Um, and in terms of like generally, do these things pencil out? It obviously depends a lot on conditions. It depends a lot on what farmers are leveraging and what they're doing on their own in their own fields. But it is oftentimes with cover crops because you're asking for additional cost for seed. And then there's the potential yield drag that is sometimes talked about for the cash crop afterwards. Like that becomes a lot harder to sell, and it becomes like I think you hear varied experiences about this, but I think oftentimes we may have the case where a farmer tries it once. It really impacted their cash crop and it really impacted their bottom line negatively in year one, and then they maybe never touched it again. And so that is where I think it's important then to just be upfront and honest about that, is that, some of those negative effects may actually be negative effects on your bottom line, may actually be sort of expected. And that's why there's these incentives in place from a federal and state perspective, is you have these cost share programs in place to sort of overcome some of those things in that first year, especially. So
one way to view these cost share programs, right, is like we're de-risking it for farmers. But another way to view it is, I guess, like society is paying for the benefit they see, right, out on the landscape. Because the whole reason we're pushing these practices, conservation practices, is because they have larger benefits beyond just kind of the farm level, right? And so I think I kind of want to take it there a little bit, as we've talked about, does it pencil out? What are the economics for farmers of these conservation practices at the farm level? But what about looking at the society level? Like, what does that look like? How do we even think about that? And maybe kind of lending that towards the amounts that these are paid to. Like, it seems like an arbitrary amount, but how are these figured out?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I think in the maybe the best framework to think this through this is like within the context of greenhouse gases and carbon. So what we have in the United States, there's a pretty general the agreements on a term of social cost of carbon. And maybe if you guys have heard of it, maybe, but essentially what that boils down to is trying to get to a single number of like, what is every single ton of carbon that's emitted in the atmosphere, what are the damages of that? And that involves things like health. It involves things like GDP growth for countries, for industry. So what that number tries to do is tries to take in all of those sort of environmental effects, and boil it down to a single number on a per ton basis, right? There's, and then when it comes to like what's the actual value of that, there's a lot of disagreements and some controversy, right? So what the EPA uses, or what the U.S. government uses in whole is $51 essentially per ton of carbon emitted into the atmosphere. So when it comes then to say a cost benefit analysis from a public and social perspective, the pretty simple question can be asked then is like, is a practice or is a change in something green, a green technology that we can get, is the benefit that we're going to get from that $51 per ton, essentially? It is I guess the cost that it takes to get that ton of carbon less than $51 per ton? If yes, then like that benefit cost analysis pencils out, right? But then there's a lot of other things that may cost more than $51 to incentivize or to put in place. So that's getting back to sort of this conversation about demand, like that's a little bit sort of the public demand for these sort of ecosystem services. And it's a little bit harder when it comes to water quality. There's a lot of other sort of nuances and actually just honestly less research that's been done by economists to get to that single number. So even though there's sort of this wide range around the social cost of carbon, what's the social cost of water pollution is it's even more varied and even more controversial. So that's in a sense like what sort of the discipline of environmental economics tries to boil down to, is getting some of these really hard to quantify sort of willingness to pay measures for society that aren't always sort of concrete into sort of monetized terms. And that's what we've done with sort of this social cost of carbon, right? So you can debate the amounts of the social cost of carbon, but that's in its essence what it's trying to do. And then so to answer your question about like how do these payment programs determine, or how does say USDA and NRCS determine how much these cost share programs should be? One, it's somewhat driven by budget constraints and what's available in the Farm Bill, or what's available in the Inflation Reduction Act. But two, it's like do those practices sort of meet that target of carbon either sequestration or avoided emissions that would have taken place if, say, you tilled up the ground? So that's a little bit long-winded answer, but that's in essence those supply and demand factors that are moving when we determine what those policy options should be.
Yeah, definitely. And Jeff, if we kind of zoom into like the individual farm here quick. How does that process look differently for like a farmer that's trying to make decisions around conservation and sort of like assessing, okay, is there quote unquote profitability or quote unquote losses from this? Uh, what are some ways that they can weigh that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so at a very basic level, thinking about like partial budgets are oftentimes what's used from extension economists is to say like if you make this minor change in your operation, is that how is that going to impact your sort of net returns in a given year? So if you're changing from sort of a conventional system to cover crop and no-till, how does your budget look one or the other? And really simply, really naively, if it pencils out, if the net returns for making that change are greater, then yeah, that's something we could recommend. However, though, and I think this is where maybe that sort of model has done a little bit of a disservice to conservation practices in general, is that with conservation, with practices that impact soil health for the farmer specifically, so this is on farm, um, those benefits may not always materialize in sort of that first year. So especially with again these two practices that we're talking about, just for simplicity and for illustration, cover crops and no-till, um, some of those the benefits of building that soil health, building even yeah just healthier soils doesn't manifest until years down the road. So if you just look at a single snapshot of a 1 year, um, maybe it doesn't pencil out in 1 year, but are you factoring in sort of those long-term benefits? Um, and then once that conversation starts coming into play, um, it's more complex, right? Like it's how much do you value sort of your future earnings versus your current earnings in this year? How much do you yeah, so that's what we call sort of a discount rate. How much do you discount future money versus money in your pocket now? The other side of this then is risk, is that knowing that if you're making a decision over the longer term, that there's going to be fluctuations, including weather fluctuations, and how when these conservation practices sort of interact with those weather variables in sort of a unique way that generates different expectations for net return based on whether it's a hot year, whether it's a dry year, whether it's a really wet year like the one we've had now. And so there's all of these factors that sort of come into play. So both this sort of discount rate factor and this conversation of risk are both things that these conservation practices, specifically cover crops and no-till, can positively impact both future earnings and positively impact the risk on farm. So research has shown that latter point. But when it comes then to making a decision today, right, it's like how much does the farmer it really comes things that are really sort of unobservable and unknowable from sort of a researcher, from our job as an extension personnel, is like how much how much do farmers value certainty, or how much are they impacted by the negative value of uncertainty? And then again, like how much do you value sort of the future versus today? Like those things are not necessarily directly observable and will vary from farmer to farmer. So that's where it then begins to be a little bit like that's our job as sort of extension professionals sort of ends there, because we can't tell farmers how much to value those things, or we can't say how much risk should be worth to them. Like that's a personal decision, right? So
I'm gonna try and zoom in even a little bit closer, and see like, is there a way that you can? I know it's difficult because it's all kind of like in the future theoretical. The values of the farmer will change the value that they're ascribing to this practice, yada yada. But you mentioned kind of these future soil health benefits and trying to capture the value of that. Like, how do you, as an economist, I mean, that's hard. It's kind of a squishy topic, right? We're trying to put science to it, but it's still a little
yeah,
squishy. How do you, as an economist, put actual numbers to future soil health?
yeah. Yeah, and that's a good question, and you know that to answering that question is complex. It requires a lot of assumptions to be put in place to get to boil down to sort of a single um, number, and it's an interdisciplinary question too, right? So I need sort of those inputs from the soil scientists to tell me, you know, how much physical change can we expect, and then to the economist then can try to put a dollar value on you know that physical change, and really simply, I mean, it's thinking about like what's the expected impacts on yields, right? So if say, okay, if we have this sort of negative impact on yields for this next cash crop, but then 10 years down the line there is a positive yield effect on that cash crop, then you know those are things that you can really value then. But for me, getting that answer about like what those yield impacts will be is a little bit. I have to rely on the agronomist and on the soil scientists when it gets to that point. So um, yeah, I feel bad sometimes that like as an economist, I'm not out actually running some of these trials, or I haven't been running these 10-year long trials to get to some of these answers. I cherry pick what the physical scientist colleagues do, and try to make the best of it from what they have. So
Yeah, definitely. And in your experience then, Jeff, like, you know, having gone through that research and sort of figuring things out, where do you think like farmers might get the biggest bang for their buck to like look first for conservation practices? Like, is there like a certain practice? Is there a certain type of program they should look for, or anything like that that you could speak into for a farm that might want to like maybe wants to get started in conservation but doesn't really have a good grasp of
right,
the economics of it?
yeah, yeah. I mean, so rather than like making, you know, widespread and sort of yeah, widespread general recommendations, I mean, I think very, very generally, I think the best my advice is just to start small and experiment, right? So and to keep records on what you are doing. I think this is where it's a little bit more a-traditional, but um, yeah, I mean, I think some of the if you were to make this change on your entire operation, that could be a pretty costly investment to do. But if you start small, experiment within say producer-led watershed groups, or with NRCS cost share dollars through EQIP or Conservation Stewardship Program, that can help, or the nitrogen optimization pilot program. Like there are these state level then programs that can also help with that. And so all of those things are sort of in place to get over that sort of initial hurdle, right? So that's what those systems are there for. There's of course this additional hurdle as well with like getting started on the paperwork to qualify for those, but um, I think that's where we have folks doing a good job of this in Wisconsin, is ensuring that people have access to the resources to get those dollars that are available to them. Um, so yeah, that's the thing. And I think start small, whether it's experimenting with, I think no-till's the easy sort of gateway to get into conservation. And then cover cropping, thinking also about like diversifying crop rotations. So maybe if you're a traditional corn soybean rotation, thinking about how like implementing say wheat or barley into your operations, because of that, implementing that third rotation also opens you up to a lot more flexibility in terms of timing. So if you can implement, say, if you can grow winter wheat, you then have a longer window to grow say, cover crops and get those cover crops in the ground before that. You know, whereas if corn, you have to do that sort of in a short window um, after harvest. So I mean, it's really, I think, building, there's a systems approach, I think, to conservation in general, and maybe a mindset shift that has to sort of take place. Is that you're thinking about like not only my returns this year, but returns in the future, and but to get to that shift and to get to that makes sense for you as a farmer, like I think you have to just experiment and to see how that plays out. And like I said, I think keep track of what those things, how those things affect your yields. Do the experiments yourself, because all of those your ground's going to react differently than somebody else's ground, and your time limitations or what works for you may not work for it may not be the same thing that works for everyone else. Um, so yeah, and then I think too, like I mentioned, that making sure that you know sort of that those options are available to you, say through NRCS or the Inflation Reduction Act, um, can also help go a long way to overcome some of those startup costs. I actually just saw this yesterday that Wisconsin is in 2024 so far. Wisconsin is the has received the most NRCS cost share dollars in 2024. Um, I don't know what that's attributed to, but like, so Wisconsin has received something like $12 million already to date in 2024, but that's greater than, really large ag states like Texas and California. So folks are doing something right. Like people are, that the word's out there and the resources are available. So I think that's something that is a success to think about. So yeah.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. Jeff, any last parting thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I am still relatively new to UW and to Wisconsin in general, but I'm putting together some resources that makes, um, particularly through decision support tools that'll make these sort of make the dollars and cents of this sort of be visualized in a little bit more appealing way. I think the traditional way to think about these things are sort of these Excel spreadsheets that require a lot of user inputs. I'm really trying to simplify that down to a web application that just requires maybe a few minutes of a farmer's time to input their baseline conditions, and to see this as an illustration, I guess, more than anything, just to be able to visualize that. So I guess be on the lookout for some of that, and I think there will be additional resources through my programming in the future. So yeah, any questions? Also, I'm always available and happy to answer via email. So
Cool. Well, I'm looking forward to those resources, that's for sure. Thanks for coming on. We really appreciate it.
yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening. This has been Field Notes from UW-Madison Extension. My name is Will Fulwider, Regional Crops Educator for Dane Dodge Counties. And I was joined by my co-host Michael Geissinger, Outreach Specialist in Northwest Wisconsin for the Nutrient and Pest Management Program of UW-Madison. A big thank you to Joe Ryan for creating our theme music and to Abby Wilkie-Maki for our logo. If you have any questions about anything you've heard today or about your farming practices in general, reach out to the Extension Agriculture Educators serving your region.